Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming this evening. I'm delighted to be welcoming you to this debate, one in a series to mark the 50th anniversary, the 50th birthday of the IFS. 5 decades of providing detailed economic analysis to inform both policy making, but most crucially to inform the public debate. Analysis which is often warmly welcomed by politicians when they agree with it, and treated with a certain froideur, shall we say, when it unexpectedly conflicts with their hopes and plans for spending when they are in government. But an absolutely crucial role, and one which I'm sure will be keeping the IFS extremely busy over the coming months, whatever the date of a future election turns out to be. More recently, the IFS has been making some very significant interventions into education. Recently, the publication of the second annual education spending report, which is tracking education in England across the different phases, revealing some quite interesting and startling disparity in the long-term trends of which children we spend the most money on as they go into adulthood. Also, of course, groundbreaking research with Cambridge and Harvard, which has led to the creation of the LEO dataset, which I'm sure we may get on to later. It's one of those either love it or loathe it subjects, but it provides, for the first time, linked into tax data, reliable information about graduate earnings. And with half of the young people in England going to university, it's a much needed bit of context to the debates and the decisions about what we subsidise, what kind of value people get, and why that particularly matters in terms of their background. So plenty to talk about. But we're going to start by hearing from the current director of the IFS, Paul Johnson.
Well, thank you very much, Branwen. I've given myself quite a big topic here, the future of education. And when I tried out my speech last week, it took more like 45 minutes than the 20 minutes that I've actually got. So I've decided to narrow down what I'm going to do quite significantly, even relative to the whole of education, but also relative to some of the things that we do at the IFS. So, for example, I'm not going to say anything about early years education, incredibly important though that is, and actually the focus of a lot of the work that my colleagues are doing. And as you'll see, there's an awful lot of other things I won't talk about in the speech, but I'm sure we'll come to in the discussion. What I want to do is really focus the talk around a puzzle. And the puzzle starts off like this. The amount of education, the number of people with high levels of qualifications, has been growing really quite fast over the last few decades. This is showing you the fraction of people in their late 20s, first of all born in the late 1960s, so that's my cohort, and indeed the IFS's, what proportion of them had at least A-level or A-level equivalent by the time they were in the late 20s, and you can see that about a third did. By the time you get to the group born in the early 90s, that had doubled. So 2/3 of people born in the early 90s had got to A-level standard, level 3 in education speak, by the time they got to their late 20s. So that's a doubling. If you look at those with degrees by the time they're in the late 20s, you actually see it's tripled, more than tripled, from about 12% to 40%. So of those born in the early 90s, about 40% have been through university and got a degree. If you look at postgraduate qualifications, well, that's more like quintupled from about 2% to 10% over that period. So the number of people, young people particularly, with very high levels, relatively high levels of education, has grown very dramatically over the past couple, 3 or 4 decades. And yet, just last week, and this I could have chosen almost any week, but just last week, we had the Industrial Strategy Council, which is the government's advisor on competitiveness and productivity, chaired by Andy Haldane, Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, bring out a report saying that productivity in the UK is held back by significant skills gaps. that 28% of workers are underqualified for the job that they have, increasing gaps in digital skills as well as management communication and analytical skills, and half of adults have only primary school numeracy levels. So you've got all of that big increase in qualifications, and yet you've got this puzzle. And big part of the puzzle here, we talk about the productivity puzzle. Productivity has flatlined over the last decade as the number of people with high levels of qualifications and education has risen. Let me just say something particularly about these numeracy and literacy skills. The next chart is probably the most messy that I'm going to bring up, but I think it's quite an important one. So I told you it was messy. This is looking at literacy, though it will also be true of numeracy skills, across a number of OECD countries and by generation. So the bright green squares are showing average scores in literacy among an older group, 55 to 65, and you can see that England's doing fairly well there. The blue square is up the distribution. The diamonds are showing the average scores for younger people, those in their early 20s. You'll see for every country bar one, younger people are cleverer than older people, or at least more literate. The one that stands out is England. Despite all of that extra education, there's been no progress over those generations in terms of literacy skills. And we see that if you look at levels of basic numeracy and basic literacy, we have relatively high levels of problems among our younger adults compared with a lot of other countries. So we have all of those. We have the first chart I showed you, lots of additional education, and then whether you believe these particular numbers or not, I don't think there's too much doubt that we do have a series of problems with skills in this country. So why is that? Well, let's start by looking at what happens to young people after they finish at school. So this is taking a cohort of young people who did their GCSEs in 2003. This is one piece of work that is not an IFS piece of work. This is from the Centre for Vocational Educational Research at the LSE. What they've done is followed people through from age 16. So about half, just under half, have got GCSEs, 5 good GCSEs at that point, just over half don't. You move on to 18, what's going on there? Well, you can see that quite a lot of those GCSEs have translated into A-levels. A rather small number have translated into what's called their level 3 vocational. In education speak, level 3 is A-level equivalent. And still quite a lot have got either only GCSEs or below, but you can see some movement away from those who have nothing. Move on to age 22. Level 6 in education speak is a degree. So we've got about a quarter, getting on for 30% have translated their A-levels into a degree. But look at the bottom group. You've still got 40% who've got nothing better than GCSEs and a quarter who have got essentially nothing. Move that on a bit further, and nothing's happened at the bottom. You've got essentially no progress among those who by 22 were only at GCSE level or below. You also see that a relatively small number, only about 15%, have got a vocational qualification at level 3 at A-level equivalent, much lower than you'll find in most of our competitor European countries. You've got quite a lot with degrees, about a third have got a degree by that point. And then you'll see that almost, maybe you won't see it, almost invisible sliver of grey. Well, you'll notice that A-level is at level 3 and the degree is at level 6. What about levels 4 and 5? Well, one of the problems with our system is we pretty much don't have these intermediate technical qualifications in this country. One of the big things that the Auger Review brought up back in the summer, everything in the system is designed to provide institutions with incentives to provide a full 3-year degree if they're a university. FE colleges have been very significantly underfunded over recent decades. We have very little in that intermediate part. So 3 big messages from this chart. First, if you get to 16, and certainly if you get to 18 with GCSEs or below, you're probably not going to make progress after that. That's a real problem. Secondly, we've got relatively few going on to vocational qualifications. There's a big slew going through A-levels and degrees, but relatively few through vocational qualifications, and almost none getting those higher level technical qualifications. 3 big problems and 3 things I think closely related to the issue that I just raised. We also, although politicians, of course, talk about a ladder of opportunities through the education system, in reality, we shut doors. Part of what you saw there was that it's very difficult for those who haven't done well by 16 to make good choices. The choices that are there are complex and they're limited. And the next figures I'm going to show you, again, come from the Centre for Vocational Educational Research at the LSE, and it's a very specific thing that they did. I think it's very nice and very clever and very illustrative of this problem. So what they did was looked at what happens to young people who just miss out on a C grade at GCSE English. And I don't mean the difference between a D and a C, I mean a 1-mark difference out of hundreds. So these young people are probably almost identical in their underlying ability and so on. And what happens to you if you miss out by one exam, by one grade? A huge amount happens. You significantly reduce your probability of enrolling in A-levels or other higher qualifications by 9 percentage points. That's a big change. Same effect on actually achieving at that level. And actually a 4 percentage point increase in the probability of not being in education at all by the time you're 18. Given that only about 12 or 15% are in that position, a 4 percentage point difference is really big. So that's just illustrative of how difficult it is to pick yourself up if you mess up, or if you're unlucky, or if you don't do quite so well at one particular point in the system. For some, doors shut early on. So this is looking at, again, looking at the 5 good GCSEs outcome, including English and maths this time. If you're doing above expected at age 11, you're pretty much guaranteed to get your 5 GCSEs. So if you get your level 5s, which is above the expected level at age 11, you're going to go through and get your GCSEs. If you get to the expected level in both, you've got a good shot. If you get below the expected level in both, you've got no shot at all. You've essentially got probability 1 of failing the only thing that's available for you to pass or to get to, which is 5 good GCSEs. And we don't have a system which actually allows any valuable different route through from age 11. And yet we know, as I say, with pretty much probability 1, that if you haven't succeeded at age 11, you're not going to succeed later on. And of course, that translates into some of those basic skills problems that I described earlier. And of course, who are the people who are not doing so well? Well, overwhelmingly, they're those from poorer backgrounds, from lower socioeconomic classes. I could have chosen one of 1,000 charts to show you that there's a huge difference between those from higher and lower socioeconomic groups. I'm choosing something that my colleagues Claire Crawford and Ellen Greaves did a couple of years ago, looking at the probability of getting to higher education according to your social background. So what this is showing you is that those from the lowest socioeconomic groups, about 20% get on into higher education. That small dark bar is the percentage you get into a high status one. Those are the ones with which require the highest A-level grades. It's not quite the same as the Russell group, but think of it as the Russell group institution. So about 20% get in, about 2 or 3% get into these high status institutions from the lowest social group. What about from higher groups? Well, as you'd probably expect, the probability is higher for those from higher groups. Now, several things to take from this. This is not just a difference between the rich and the rest, and it's not just a difference between the poor and the rest. Like many things, it's socially graded. Each point you move up the social class spectrum, the higher your probability of success. You see exactly the same kind of pattern if you're looking at health outcomes, mortality, all of these things. They're socially graded. Secondly, in terms of getting into higher education, you've got 3 times the probability if you're from the highest group than if you're from the lowest group. And that gap has actually closed somewhat over time as more people from lower social backgrounds have gone into higher education. But look at those high status institutions, the ones where you can really go on into the high paid jobs. That's a 10 times difference between the top group and the bottom group in terms of probability of getting there. Now, this isn't because universities are in some sense discriminating against those from poorer backgrounds. Pretty much all of this is determined by the time you've done your GCSEs. Almost absolutely all of it is determined by A-level results. Half of it is determined at age 11. So half of that gap you can completely explain by how well young people are doing at age 11. So I'm not complaining at the way that higher education institutions are selecting their students, but this is just an illustration of the gaps that our system lives with. And this matters. So what happens in the labour market to those people who haven't got very much in the way of education if they've got GCSEs or below? Well, that's the average, or the median, in fact, hourly earnings over time. It's a bit less than £10 an hour. A bit more, but not much more than the minimum wage. And that's the median for the lower educated group by the time they're in their late 20s and early 30s. That's a pretty poor outcome, illustrating the relative lack of employable skills that these people have. And there's a big gap between that line and having a degree. You do a lot better, as you'd expect if you've got a degree. And the gap between those lines has pretty much held up over time, despite the fact there are a lot more people with degrees. So it matters a lot. And it matters, so this is for people in the late 20s and early 30s. I think one of the crucial things, what these two charts are showing, is that it matters more over time. So look at the left-hand chart. That's showing you what happens to wages over time as men and women age if they've only got GCSEs. You can see the lower line for women is incredibly flat. I mean, essentially wages rise to about age 25, and then they flatline at not much different to the minimum wage rate. For men, it goes up a bit more, but it still flattens off relatively early. If you've got a degree, they rise much more quickly. Flatten off earlier for women, and that's really very much associated with childbirth. But the key point here is that education breeds not just a better start in the labour market, but even more importantly, much better progress in the labour market. And who gets training in the labour market? Those who already have education. Education breeds education and training. Those who enter the labour market with relatively low skills get very little additional training whilst they're there. Now, up till now, in a sense, I've been speaking as if getting into university is almost the be-all and end-all, and that gives you success, and all is well when you get there. But no, look at that graduate earnings line again. Average hourly earnings among graduates in their late 20s today are no higher than they were a quarter of a century ago. Now, part of that is a compositional effect. There are more graduates. They're being drawn, presumably, from a slightly less skilled part of the potential market. But you would expect that an effective education system, an effective higher education system that was providing the sorts of skills that the labour market is really demanding would see those salaries rise over time. And you can see, actually, since the financial crisis, they've come down somewhat. So you've got stagnant earnings. Why have you got stagnant earnings? Well, it's partly to do with the fact that where the degree that you do makes a big difference to the earnings that you end up with, and we have a lot of people doing degrees which don't appear to provide very much in the way of higher returns. And I'm not saying that the only thing that matters about education or the only thing that matters about higher education is what you earn, but it's clearly an important element. So this is, Brangwyn was referring to the LEO data, the longitudinal educational outcomes data earlier. This is using that data. Colleagues of mine done an enormous amount of work with this data. And this is showing for men, what are the returns to the best that we can estimate it from for doing different degrees. And it's saying that if you're wise, like some of us were, and do economics, then you earn quite a lot more. Maybe not so wise to go to the IFS, but anyway. Medicine, as you'd expect, business, law, engineering, computing, you earn quite a lot more than you would do if you hadn't gone through the university system. But on the other end of the scale, there's actually quite a lot of subjects where, as best we can make out, you actually earn less as a result of doing that degree than you would have done had you gone straight into the labour market. The key point here is that you don't get much in the way of economic returns from quite a range of degrees, and those are quite big degrees. Lots of people do creative arts and English and so on. I should say the picture looks a bit different for women. There's more consistent benefits to higher education for women, partly because less well-educated women do so badly in the labour market that the returns to higher education are higher. So returns to degrees are hugely variable by subject. But what are funding system does is effectively give bigger government subsidies to those subjects where people do less well, because of course the amount you pay back depends on your earnings. Most graduates won't pay back all that they borrow in order to pay for their degrees. And who are the ones who are going to earn least? Well, they're the ones on the left-hand side, the ones who are getting least. So for example, we spend about 1.2 billion a year of government money funding about 37,000 creative arts students. We spend about £500 million a year funding 19,000 engineering students. The amount per student is a lot less for the engineering students than the creative arts students, despite the fact that it costs more. I mean, an engineering degree costs more to provide. Now, is that the right way of spending government money? I don't know. Is it the intention of the system? I don't think it was. I don't think anyone sat down and thought, well, let's spend 1.2 billion a year on 37,000 creative arts students and spend a rather less than half of that on 19,000 engineering students. And again, one of the conclusions, I think, from the Auger Review, or Philip Auger, I know, thought this was a pretty bizarre way of funding higher education. So part of the reason that you've got that flat lining of graduate returns, of graduate earnings, is that we have an awful lot of people doing degrees that really don't have very much value at all in the labour market. And just to add to that, again, I said, it's not the case that simply getting to university sorts everything out. What is this saying? Well, this is saying that those graduates from about the top 25 or 30% of households in terms of their parental income earn on average, the men, about nearly 25% more than graduates from the bottom three-quarters of the income distribution. Women, a similar amount, maybe 17% more. Now, that's not surprising. You saw that people from those social groups are more likely to go to the Russell Group universities. They've probably got better A-levels and so on average, from those from lower social groups. So what we, or rather my colleagues, have done is look at what happens to that if you control for the university that someone went to, the course that they studied. Now, you would expect, I think, that if a group of people study the same subject at the same university, they all on average to get the same earnings at the end. But no. What this is essentially saying is if you're from a higher social group and you go to the same university, you study the same subject as someone from the bottom 75%, these are big groups. This isn't the sort of top against the bottom. This is the sort of top 25, 30% against the rest. They still earn more than 10% more 10 years into their jobs. And that gap probably grows further through time. So universities are not closing that social gap, and they're probably not inculcating some of the skills that some of these young people are going to need. So where does that leave us? I just want to draw out from that very swift run through some very particular issues, some potential lessons for the future. I think one is an important point, actually, for governments. Just getting more and more people through qualifications isn't enough. We saw this particularly under the last Labour government with targets for all sorts of outcomes in terms of qualifications. This government's got targets for the number of people going through apprenticeships. We should not be focusing just on numbers going through qualifications. That's not what gets people the skills that they need. Terribly important to have better routes for those not getting 5 good GCSEs. It's incredibly hard for those young people to navigate their way through the school and further education system post-16, and a lot of them don't navigate themselves very far, and they don't navigate themselves to particularly good literacy and numeracy skills. Absolutely crucial in terms of closing those skills gaps that I opened with. Lots and lots of people go through the A-level and university route. We've got more young people going to university than virtually any other country, in fact. Other routes exist. Other routes should be taken much more seriously. We need a framework for levels 4 and 5, a funding framework, some incentives for people to do that. We know that these are valuable skills. We know that they are rewarded in the labour market. We know that other countries do a lot more of this, and yet we provide a framework for funding which makes it almost impossible for institutions to make these available to very many young people. Probably most importantly here is clarity and stability for the vocational route. Now, one thing I haven't said very much about is current government policy. A lot of current government policy, in principle, makes some sense. We're seeing so-called T levels coming in next year, which is a vocational equivalent or technical equivalent to A levels, or supposed to be. A lot of the reforms that are happening to apprenticeship make a good deal of sense. The problem, in a sense, is this is the second or third or fourth iteration of the same effort by generations of governments, and we have no stability in that system. We have very little clarity about it. Contrast that with what's happening with GCSEs and A-levels. These are recognizably the same things as existed in the 1940s. I mean, they've changed their name, but and I'm sure any teachers in the audience will think, what do you mean they're stable? They change every year, but they change within very narrow frameworks. People understand what these things are. They have a very clear brand. Arguably, they're too stable. Why do we have GCSEs? They were introduced originally because most young people left school at 16. This was a leaving certificate. Nearly everyone stays on post-16 at the moment, so why we have them? Actually, the only reason we have them is because we've always had them. A-levels, as we all know, are extremely narrow, so a very, very internationally curious system with not very obvious benefits. Universities are not the be-all and end-all. The fact that we've got getting towards 50% of young people going to university does not mean that all of those 50% of young people are doing the right thing, are being well trained for what really matters, are going to do well in the labour market. A lot of them aren't, and it's a very expensive way of achieving what we're currently achieving. So we don't just want to focus on that as an end. And then there's a whole lot of other things that I haven't mentioned, but I'm sure that Branwen will elicit that from Anna and David. Thank you.
Thank you. A fantastic description of some of the paradoxes of the system. More people than ever before going to university. Huge reforms that have gone through the school system, and still so many people left behind. I hope later on you'll join in our conversation, but now it's time to introduce our panel. David Laws, the Executive Chairman of the Education Policy Institute, who of course was in government with the Coalition as Schools Minister, and Professor Anna Vignoles from the University of Cambridge. Can I start with you, Anna? What do you see as the big structural factors in our education system that have led us to the situation which Paul has outlined?
So if we think about the origins of GCSEs and A-levels, they were very much hurdles that were designed to identify a small minority. Obviously, they were called O-levels in those days, but a small minority of people that were proceeding down a particular route. Because we still have them, we hinge everything on them, as Paul has just illustrated. If you fail that magic 5 A stars to C or equivalent now, there's a massive cost that you pay in terms of your progression. But more than that, essentially, it builds in this sense that you have essentially failed in the education system. Now that we all expect young people to stay on it in school until the age of 18, there's a clear argument that would suggest that students might be doing different things according to their prior attainment level. Also that you could build in different measures of success so that all students could take a route that was suitable for them. So I think if you had to pick one structural barrier to making real change, ironically enough, it's the bit of the system that most people think of as successful, i.e. the GCSEs and the A-levels. But this is what's causing that bifurcation that is quite so problematic.
And yet, David Laws, it would be a brave politician who took on, potentially in one term of a government, massive structural change. From your experience inside the department, what were the possibilities of thinking radically? What are the things that get in the way of being able to make big structural changes to the system?
I mean, in my experience, even during a period of austerity, when government budgets were being pared back, actually, if you know what you want to do in government, and you've got the support from the top, by which I mean Number 10 and the Treasury, you can do quite a lot of most things quite quickly. And if you remember in 2012-13, when I was coming into the education department, actually there was a debate and discussion going on not about getting rid of GCSEs altogether and having some completely new system, but actually about going back to the old O-level CSE divide. And the present Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, then working for Michael Gove, was arguing that we should tear up all the GCSEs, go back to O-levels and CSEs. And of course, for a while, we didn't do that, but we were going to bring in the English Baccalaureate Certificate, which you've all forgotten about, but that was going to be a new qualification. And then when we decided that that was too risky because we were moving too quickly, we changed all the GCSEs and renumbered them and redesigned them and changed quite a lot of the content. So I think you can do things quite quickly, and even in a time of austerity, there was more money in each spending statement and budget to go around than there were good ideas to spend money on. The things I think that are difficult to do in government in education quickly are things that relate to areas where the government can't simply pull a lever and change things overnight. Not the finance stuff, not the qualifications, not the accountability. You can do that really quickly. It's things that are delivered through a workforce of hundreds of thousands of teachers. So structural change in money and accountability is very easy to do. But if you want to think about how you improve the teaching behavior and methods and professional development of a workforce of hundreds of thousands of people, that is really something that policymakers are very ill-equipped to do and to think about.
One of the things, Paul, that you touched on in your talk was the fact that at 11 and the attainment then, it's a very strong predictor in our current system of what will happen to a segment of young people right up and into their working life in terms of how they will do in our education system. And yet all the international evidence suggests that selecting early tends to be something that widens disadvantages and differences rather than selecting later. Many other systems select later on, for example, at the age of 16, giving people a choice of where to go. We have a mixed economy with that. What's your view of that, with the idea of grammar schools, for example, being floated as a potential contender in a Conservative manifesto?
Yeah, I think one of my colleagues actually tweeted that this was a zombie idea, which seems to come round quite a lot. I don't think, given the way that the system works at the moment, it's very hard to know to what question more grammar schools is the answer. I think the question is, what are the sets of things that you might want to put in place which actually help those who are not doing so well at the moment? Now, part of it obviously starts actually before school. We were talking before just now about how important in some other countries having really high quality early years education at 3, 4, 5, 6 is in terms of ironing out some of these gaps and preparing young children. Often starting school in some other systems, starting formal school somewhat later. So what happens early on is clearly really important. But within our current system, I don't think the issue is so much, do you select one group to go over here and one group to go over there? I think it's more recognizing that you've got a group who, under the current system, are clearly, I mean, it's sad, but it's true, clearly going to fail to make the GCSE grade. You've got 2 or 3 choices, I think. One is you have a system which runs through to 18, not to 16, and provides increasing choice and specialisation as you get through there. So you move towards more technical or vocational or other qualifications as you get to 18, or something which provides more of that at 16, but pretending to these kids who are not daft. I mean, they understand that they're on a path to failure, pretending to them that they're heading towards this benchmark, which, as Anna said, was set. It was specifically set to weed the sheep from the goats, and actually to have a system which gives them a chance of attaining a valuable qualification at 16 or 18 seems to me to be absolutely the crucial outcome.
I mean, anecdotally, it's certainly something that teenagers in schools in deprived areas that I go into say, that they feel the system is very set up for people who are going to do well at the particular hurdle of GCSEs. Anna, what would make a difference? Would it, as Paul suggests, be to have a more differentiated curriculum in which there were viable alternatives that could sit aside the core skills that they need? Because they will need literacy skills, numeracy skills, whatever route they're going to take.
Yeah, so I mean, just before I come on to that, I think there's an important point here, and the grammar school debate sort of illustrates it, which is there's normally far more concern at the top end about provision. And if we assume it's not just because it's their children, and think that it's actually a genuine concern about our top end, and by that I mean the most skilled people, the productivity that we have in our workforce, etc. There's a genuine concern that we don't undermine what we have at the top end. So I'd like to just also point out that I don't think our current system serves them well either. And what we're seeing in the university sort of illustrates that. We get too narrow too soon. Students stop maths often at 16, but could go on to an elite university. There are very few countries in the world where someone could call themselves, highly educated at an elite institution, having stopped any mathematics at all at 16. That's an odd thing. And you can see that as they come out the other side with labour market earnings that vary, as Paul showed, by subject, partly because they're not coming out with the mix and the broad range of skills.
Is that partly a sort of cultural bias? I mean, you do not come across people who say, who are reasonably well educated, who say, I struggle with books, or I don't read. And yet, almost culturally, there's an acceptance that we don't have to have higher level math skills.
Yes, so the numeracy, yes, it drives me nuts. Absolutely. You see people even educated to PhD level who claim not to be able to do numbers, and that's a worry. But to be fair, I would say that you have scientists who stopped doing serious amounts of writing at the age of 16. So it is the narrowness of our curriculum. So if we started thinking that GCSEs and A-levels and that narrowness don't serve well at the top end either, it might be possible to move the debate on and to come back to your original question, where you do have less assessment, or the assessment comes somewhat later. The specialisation can come according to interest, but where we're also building in this idea that you are doing a broad set of basic skills, often to a high level, but literacy and numeracy, etc., if you're at the lower end, and that's really important in the labour market.
One of the ideas of the English baccalaureate was to get students studying a wide range of subjects, academic subjects, so there would be a language, history, geography, the sciences. David, do you think it was a mistake not to allow that to be more modular, to have something that was perhaps a more functional or technical skill in being introduced that could be substituted for one or more of those subjects, providing the opportunity for more people to do it? Because lots of schools simply are saying that this isn't fit for purpose for all of our pupils, so we're just not going to try and enter them all for this range of subjects.
Gosh, that's a very big question. I mean, I think that there is a really interesting question, first of all. I'm much more cautious than Paul is about the need to dump the proven brand of GCSEs and A-levels. And I think that while you have some narrowing down at 16, you need a qualification that registers what people have achieved in the subjects they give up.
Even if they're not going into work at that stage, but they're going on to continue
I think,
studying.
I think there'll be many students who will give up a range of subjects for good reason at age 16, and I would recognise that in a national examination and qualification at that age. I think the interesting question is how broad is the curriculum beyond 16, and I think we ought to look at that again as a nation for the reasons that Anna gave. And I think we are designing a post-16 curriculum rather on the basis of what used to be a minority of people who wanted to go on to be absolute subject specialists in the one subject they focused on at university. That's a bit out of date. On the wider question that you're sort of posing about what a core curriculum should look like and whether the EBAC is the right sort of collection of subjects, I think we struck the right balance in the incentives we created in the accountability system in 2013 with the Progress 8 and Attainment 8 that gave people a nudge in the direction of certain core subjects, but not in a way that forced everybody in every school in the country, for example, to do a modern language, which I don't think is helpful. I do wonder whether in some of the areas that we really struggle in some of the sort of functional mathematics and functional English and use of English, that our qualifications there are fit for purpose. And I think that we could be looking at the types of maths and English that people actually need to be successful in life and in the labour market, and separating that off from some of the maths and English literature that we need to go for other areas of life and for other skills. And that, I think, is something that would be worth looking at. But I thought we need a bit of controversy on this panel, don't we? And I thought Paul was having it both ways a bit in his presentation by saying, you know, poor old vocational technical, they've had all this instability and nobody knows what's going on. We've got this wonderful GCSE A-level brand. And then he said, let's get rid of the GCSEs and A-levels and, you know, have sort of turbulence
Have something
there.
else instead.
And I think we should use the proven brands as the sort of brands that cover pretty much all this range of subjects. And having loads of different sort of brands is really, really unhelpful.
You might find as well that there's limited appetite for more change in the school system right now from rather weary teachers and head teachers who've been implementing it. I'm sure we might hear that in a little while from the audience. But Paul, coming back to this idea of, you know, how then you keep this those teenagers engaged who are struggling with the core academic subjects, how do you have something that's absolutely fit for them? What do we need, without going back to some of the forest of vocational GCSE equivalents, many of which were frankly discredited and weren't terribly recognised by employers, and certainly didn't give those children the opportunity to have a choice maybe at 16 of where they could aim for?
A difficult question. I think the answer is that we need something in the end which it will take a long time to bring in, because it needs to be done, needs to be something which has that level of agreement that will stay in place for a long period of time, that is well designed, that maybe at 16 or maybe at 18. I think the problem is not it's so much that there's never been anything there. The problem has been that there's never been anything of adequate quality and stability that's there. And that requires agreement across parties and over a long period of time. And I think one of the things I would plea for whoever is the next Secretary of State for Education, whatever party they are, that they don't dump T-levels, that they don't dump the current apprenticeship system, that they don't dump where we are at the moment, as this current government did actually with quite a lot of what it inherited in that area. The key is, if it needs reforming, if it needs changing, if it needs improving, then take the structures that we've got and try and make them work over a long period of time. Don't just say, well, that was the last lot's ideas, let's go on with this. And that's what I was contrasting really with the A-level GCSE sort of world. 70 years is quite a long time without any serious change to a structure, whereas for the rest of the vocational world, it changes every 10. And I think probably you need some balance between those so that you can think seriously about the structure of the one that's been there forever, and really find some stability over a period of decades for the one that's changing the entire time.
Anna, one of the aims of the T-levels is to give some kind of parity of esteem to different routes. How difficult will that be, and what might it take to even begin that?
So I'm feeling my age here, because I think the parity of esteem phrase has been used pretty much every decade for the last...
Each time it changes.
And I think we need to just understand why it is that we're seeking it. And I think sometimes we confuse our policy aims. So for some, the vocational technical route, if you actually press, it's not about some of our most skilled young people gaining high-quality vocational and technical qualifications. It's about bringing up the bottom. It's about focusing on the least skilled group. That's a completely different policy aim, actually. If you're talking about those levels 4 and 5 that Paul was saying were missing from our system, those are high levels of skill. They're just not academic skill. And so whatever we do with T-levels, we really need to remember we're trying to get a higher proportion with high-level vocational and technical skills, which means we won't be necessarily drawing people from the very bottom of the skill distribution as it stands at the moment. We should be, if anything, deflecting some of those who are currently heading off on a graduate track. And then the second issue is, okay, that's all fine, but you do have this long tail, maybe a fifth of our current cohort, who lack adequate literacy and numeracy. That has to be a central goal as they progress through the school system. And whilst there's been a huge amount of sort of reform of the accountability system, trying to put ever-increasing emphasis on this, that is within the constraints of the GCSE system, which, English literature as it's currently devised may not be that suitable for some of those students who are struggling with their literacy. So we need to think hard about that. And that's separate from vocational and technical.
One of the controversial aspects of the attempts to bring up the bottom has been the resits, the compulsory resits for maths and English. Extremely expensive for FE colleges to deliver. And all the evidence of the results is the closer you get to 19, having sat a GCSE 3 or 4 times, the less likely you are. Should we scrap it, as Labour is suggesting they might?
I think you really have to doubt the wisdom of that policy, given that it's not working. But I think we also need to reflect on reflect on what we actually are looking at there. And this, our teachers, by and large, are highly committed. We have lots of good teaching going on in our system. Actually, on average, our kids don't do too badly at age 15, even in international tests, although, that's not always widely reported. So if you take the sort of average quality of the system as given, we still have this group of students who have managed to progress from the age of 5 through to the age of 16, and they are functionally illiterate or innumerate. So there's no sense that you're just going to tweak that to solve that problem, and it will need different remedies, and I'm fairly confident that doing the GCSE again is not going to work it. Now, obviously, there are people on the margins that maybe this, might be a good policy, but for the really...
But so there'll be people who've missed by maybe a small amount, who could, with a bit of additional effort, get across. But are you saying that really we need to be thinking much more fundamentally about those children who are not attaining to a good level at ages, 7, 8, 9, that it's way too late to be trying to pick up the pieces at 16?
Absolutely, and if you look at what happens when they go to secondary school and you're sitting as a student who's struggling with your literacy and numeracy, studying a huge range of subjects, I can't imagine what that feels like. Incomprehensible for some of it, I would imagine. Imagine learning German, being taught it in English, and your literacy is weak. I mean, that's a really, really big challenge, and it's expensive to fix. And as Paul showed so well, it's highly related to your socioeconomic background. And we know language in particular, a lot of the sort of heavy lifting on language developments, not only happening 0 to 5, but it's happening sort of outside any formal learning structures. So the family background's making a massive difference there. And so the solutions are going to be far more complicated than making them retake their GCSE.
You mentioned diverting people. If you're going to have a system that really works for everyone, you want good people taking all routes. There is a question which refuses to go away, which is, do we have too many people going to university now, too many people doing standard 3-year academic degrees? I mean, Paul, you're nodding. Clearly, part of your thesis is that, yes, we do in some ways, because it's not delivering for them or for the economy by the age of 30.
It's not delivering for the economy, certainly. It's not delivering for them in terms of their earnings. I mean, as I said, I was quite narrowly focused there, and it's delivering other things. And we know that there are, in terms of many other outcomes, graduates do look much better off in terms of their health and their well-being and participation and so on than non-graduates. So there are a lot of other benefits to going through higher education. But I do think that if you look at, if you take seriously the importance of skills and earnings and growth and productivity and so on, I think it's pretty clear that we're sending quite a significant group of young people to university who would economically be much better off if there were good level 3, 4, 5 qualifications of a more technical kind or of a more vocational kind or of a kind that is really linked to the labour market, because we know that a lot of those young people who go into the labour market from the less relevant degree courses struggle. I mean, the numbers who come out with arts degrees who find it frankly very difficult to get jobs which are graduate level jobs is very significant indeed. Now, as I say, they will get a lot of consumption value from the higher education. There may be other kinds of values from it, but from an economic point of view, if you were designing a system to equip people for the labour market, you wouldn't be designing the system that we have at the moment, where such a large fraction are going down that route. Now, I don't know what the right number is. Is it 30%, 40%? But I very much doubt it's 50%.
David Laws, do you think it's practical to try and limit the number of people doing certain types of degrees by tweaking the subsidies, perhaps revisiting some of the ideas that Philip Auger and the panel looked at?
I thought there were some interesting ideas in the Auger report, including thinking more about the cost of delivering degrees and how we subsidise. I also agree very much with Paul that there is a sense that post-18 the funding system has driven, and a sense of what society thinks is appropriate, has driven decisions rather than a sort of rational funding structure and an ability for people to pick and choose courses which may be shorter. Personally, I think we'll go on seeing participation post-18 rise and rise and rise, and that may well include people attending universities as well. But I would hope that we have a system that drives rational decision-making rather than saying, unless you're doing a level 6, we're not going to fund you properly. Can I just come back very briefly on the other issue that you touched on about the subject choices at 16? I think in recognizing that at the moment there are some students who really struggle with the existing GCSEs, we definitely don't want to accept that anything like the present proportion of students who fail to get, standard maths and English qualifications and other GCSEs, that there's anything inevitable about that. We know that the attainment gap between poor and the rest of the student population has been, until very recently, narrowing. We know that some schools, even in very poor areas, have seen tremendous improvements in results. And notwithstanding what I said earlier on about difficulties of English literature and sort of higher maths for some students, actually, when we effectively made English literature GCSE compulsory after the Gove reforms in 2013-14, because of what we did to the accountability system, we suddenly had an enormous increase in poor children taking English literature GCSE, because they basically had to in order to get the sort of school league table accountability. And contrary to the assumption that that might have widened the gap between poor students and the rest that year, it actually narrowed it. Poor students were doing better comparatively in English literature compared to the gap in other subjects. What I do regret in terms of some of the choices we made when I was a minister around the accountability regime in trying to allow for technical and vocational education, decent qualifications to be given some sort of status, is that we didn't fight hard enough, or that I didn't fight hard enough to recognize the place of higher quality vocational qualifications. And I can remember, I'll say precisely how, but I can remember a conversation about teacher shortages in that period of time and what level to set the bursary at. And I got a series of proposals from civil servants saying we are expecting these types of shortages of recruitment in all of these areas, and therefore we recommend these levels of bursary to try to increase recruitment. And the only one that stood out as not consistent between the shortage of teachers that we were expecting and the level of the bursaries was D&T, where we were expecting only to recruit sort of 40% of the teachers that we needed, and yet we got virtually no bursary. And when we really sort of pressed the officials as to why they'd come up with this set of proposals, they said,
values,
Minister, the view is essentially that bursaries are set to meet the full 100% recruitment target, except that some subjects are not as important as others, and D&T is not as important. And actually, if we could design some high-quality, credible technical and vocational subjects, give them the same brand as all the other things, I'd make them, frankly, GCSEs and A-levels as well, and then recognize that in not only the political and policymaker narrative, but in things like the choices we make about the accountability system, it would take those types of changes to really make a difference. And although I thought we'd achieved something quite good in allowing vocational and technical subjects with sort of credible status to be included in the Progress 8 and Attainment 8 accountability targets, actually that wasn't enough. And I rather regret that we didn't allow the sort of core accountability 5 subjects that you have to do.
To take account
One
of
of
those
those
subjects.
to be maybe design a great D&T type technical subject and put it in the science bucket and allow that to be one of those sort of things. And when I talk to most people still today about subjects like D&T, it's regarded in most schools, actually more so even in the state system than in a private system, as being a second-rate subject that you only do if you can't cut it in the real sciences. While that's the case, we're always going to have the sense that technical vocational is second-rate and that it's not quite as important as the other things.
And I just want to come back to how people make choices. I mean, on one level, the Leo data is pretty unique worldwide in providing people with information about what their earnings will be. But is there any evidence that that's going to influence the decisions of teenagers, young people coming from lower income backgrounds any more than it is from other backgrounds? Or are decisions actually primarily driven by interest, by choice of subject that people like, by inclination, by familiarity perhaps, rather than choosing an unfamiliar subject like economics, which maybe you won't have studied at school?
Absolutely. So, I mean, Leo is an important source of information. Just to sort of clarify your point, it doesn't tell you about what you're going to earn. It tells you what you earned had you taken that subject in the past.
Yeah.
But if you're buying a car, you tend to want to have a full range of information in front of you when you buy the car, but you might still choose it on the basis of colour. I do get a little bit frustrated when I think that there's an unfairness here, that the kinds of students who perhaps don't need Leo are those where they've already got a lot of experience of higher education in the family, and they will be told by people, and everybody knows which occupations and which professions are well paid and which universities. Exactly. So, I mean, I think Leo is a minimum, because I don't think that we should be expanding higher education, making monumental decisions about the kids making monumental decisions about where to study without having that information. But you're absolutely right. Of course, they take into a wide range of factors into account, and family and other things will have a lot of influence. Geography, what courses are nearby, makes a lot of difference, particularly to students from poor backgrounds. And that sort of leads full circle to saying, well, if we cannot cap the numbers going, or choose not to cap the numbers going into higher education, do we just throw up our hands and say, oh, they're all doing degrees that don't have value in the labour market? Or should we be thinking through, doesn't that mean that we need to think about our degree structure and what range of skills that we embed into those degrees, so that all students, irrespective of subject, come out with a set of skills that is nearer, at least, to what the labour market would want? And I think that's really important, because we did have and do have really good, valuable vocational qualifications like HNC, HND, but we still see people heading off in the degree route. So whilst that's happening, we need to make sure those degree routes end up with valuable skills at the end of them.
One of the very startling slides, Paul, that you showed was that even when you adjust for other factors, people from wealthier backgrounds will still do better as graduates in terms of earnings. Are there other things that could be done in terms of signalling, like focusing on some of those industries where unpaid internships are absolutely rife, and people are essentially almost expected to work unpaid for a year in a big city before they could even hope to get a graduate level job in their chosen profession?
Well, I mean, I think that sort of behaviour by big companies is pretty outrageous. I mean, it's the barriers to those with limited resources in some industries. There's by no means all. I suspect your industry is one of the worst, Bradley.
I'm fully hands up. Although
I'm not blaming you personally, but
no.
I think there's.
I should say the BBC doesn't have unpaid internships.
But I think one of the reasons that there's media focus is because the media is one of the worst offenders. But I think there's lots of things going on there. I think in terms of why you get those outcomes from these groups, where, as I said, almost intuitively, you might think that if you're an employer and you're looking at two kids, one from a less privileged background than the other, and they've got the same degree from the same university, you might think, well, the one from the less privileged background's probably got a bit more to them, but that's not sort of how it works. I think there are several things probably going on. One is about choices. So I mean, knowing where to make the choice, which jobs to apply for in the first place. One is the sorts of skills that get you through an interview. And then there's all of these softer skills around communication and management and so on, which it may be easier to display if you've had a particular kind of experience. And I think one of the errors I made as an undergraduate was to think it really matters, actually do really well in my degree and get a first-class degree and so on, and you get on. But actually, that's not what you learn. That's not what most employers care about. The IFS cares. They
Just
really,
before anyone gets any
they
ideas.
really want a really good economics degree. Yeah. But most employers, they don't really care how good you are at history or whether you've got a first or 2-1 in philosophy or what have you. What they care about is all these other things which you're not actually taught at university. You're supposed to kind of get it by osmosis or know that you get it by joining the debating society or whatever it is. So I think it's a combination of those things supposedly coming by osmosis, the way that employers select. And actually, we're quite unusual in having, I think by European standards, having most of the people who go through universities end up in jobs that have nothing to do with the degree that they're taking. That's relatively unusual. If you look at many more of those in places like France and Germany who go through university will do things and then go to a job which requires that kind of qualification. So I think all of those things matter. And again, it's based in deep history about the way that universities...
A gentleman's education.
A gentleman's education and an assumption that, for most graduate jobs, it doesn't matter what you've done your degree in, and therefore it doesn't really matter if you're the best, but you really put the effort into being really good at English or history or maths or whatever it was. It's other stuff, and, if you don't know what that other stuff is, then you're not going to go so well.
One of the fascinating things when you delve deeper into the Leo data is that even if you look at, for example, at the creative arts subjects, there is a huge disparity between institutions. And some of the ones that are doing considerably better than that headline figure suggests are ones with sandwich courses or investing very, very heavily in employability skills and work experience for the students right from the moment when they arrive. So it is possible to improve things for people choosing those courses. Plenty of provocation and thought there. Should we have different sort of qualifications up to the age of 16? When do we need to intervene at a younger age? I think this is a good time to throw the conversation open. There are roving mics. If you would like to introduce yourself, if you have a question, say who you are, where you're from. And we'd love questions rather than statements, I think, as often happens at these events. So who would like to ask a question first? You're a remarkably shy audience. There's a question here, marvellous, and then the gentleman further along.
Hi, my name's Anya. I'm from UNICEF UK. I actually have lots of questions, but I'll stick to just one. You described us as internationally curious, which I thought was fascinating. And I was wondering if, as we're curious, what you would consider perhaps a not curious or a better example. Are there other education systems that you think we can learn from or should be learning from?
Okay, and I'm
it's
going to
directed at everyone, but kind of mainly Paul.
I'm going to take one more question, then we'll answer two at a time, so the gentleman who's sitting nearby.
Thank you. Tom from the Royal Academy of Engineering. Given that schools quite often guide pupils towards either humanities and the arts and towards science separately, you tend to rarely get pupils that do a mixture of those two things at A-level, and they tend to become special later on. Could an issue with the productivity puzzle or not having the skills is that we are having pupils that don't have that kind of mixture, and could schools and perhaps universities be doing more to encourage people to take a mix of A-levels, given that reforms to GCSEs and A-levels are probably unlikely in the near future?
So two really good questions there. Anna, do you want to have a go at that first part, which is, if ours is the oddity, and perhaps Paul as well as he drew it up, if our system is the oddity internationally, what is one that we should be aspiring to or aiming for, taking into account things like cultural differences? I mean, often we talk about systems like Singapore, but it is culturally a very different place from the UK.
Yeah, and I think there's a real danger sort of for heading, particularly for small city-states or particular, social environments and saying we want to be like that. So I think probably what's more constructive is to look, particularly across Northern European countries, and look at the elements of their systems that work and try and work out what we're missing. So, for example, on the vocational side of things, what you would, I think, be really struck by is how our engagement with employers looks very different compared to, say, Germany, Switzerland, Austria. And that probably matters a great deal in terms of building stable and high-quality vocational technical education systems. Now, I once said that our level of engagement, or the level of employers' engagement in our education system, is less than in other countries, and that didn't go down so well. But I would genuinely say that the level of interaction between employers and the system in some of these other countries is very impressive, and that means there's a bit more mutual understanding. Here, I think one of the issues is that often, say, universities feel that employers are just saying, we would like an oven-ready person, and they lack this, and they lack this, and they lack this, and it needs to be more of a conversation and a dialogue, I think, so that we can better understand what the labour market actually needs.
Paul and then David, can I ask you to speak to this, perhaps the second part, which is this idea that we still have a very binary system, that you're seeing whatever you do at GCSE level across a range of subjects, and of course the EPAC does have that, to then be steered primarily towards the sciences or the humanities. Speaking to Anna's earlier point, that so many people just stop maths completely at age 16.
Well, I think whilst you've got the A-level system, it's very hard to avoid. And I think actually it's one of the downsides of essentially having got rid of AS levels, is that a lot of schools, including those that my children are at, they force a choice of 3 immediately out of GCSE because there's no longer AS levels. A lot of people who might otherwise have had a go at maths, drop it. So I don't know what we'll see as a result of that, but I think there are risks there. But I think if you've got a 3 or even 4, then it's quite difficult to do that mix, particularly if you think you're a bit better at one or the other, and you know that actually the only thing that really matters is the grades that you get. So you're going to focus on the things you think you're going to get the best grades at. So I think within our current system, within our A-level system, it's a pretty hard thing to do. I mean, there are sort of, odd people like me who did a mix a long time ago, but I think on average that's where you're going to go with, if you're doing 3 or 4 subjects, you're not going to get very many people who are going to do further maths and French.
David, was that a structural mistake in the system to take AS out of the accountability? Because we did see the numbers plummeting, and actually maths was one of the subjects that was really affected.
Yeah, I don't think keeping AS would have been the right answer, though I'm concerned about some of the sort of contraction in maths. The reason that I eventually supported getting rid of the AS level, having thought about it quite carefully, was that my worry was that the last 3 years of education prior to university or whatever else you're doing were turning, and still are a bit, into an exam factory. And basically from year 10 onwards, people were spending a huge proportion of their time just preparing for public examinations, and AS levels made that, I think, worse. So I think it's created a bit more space to actually learn rather than prepare for examinations. But I do agree, and this has been a theme of all sort of 3 of our comments, that there's a real issue about post-16, whether the curriculum, including post-18, whether the sort of model we've got is too narrow and is based upon the assumption that the people who go on to post-16 and post-18 know that they want to be sort of master economists or master historians or whatever. And actually most people are not that certain, and they probably want to narrow things down a bit from what they did at GCSE, but they may want to do maths, or they may want to do a modern language. And I don't see anything wrong with sort of redesigning A-levels and allowing people to have a wider suite of A-levels. And that is something that we ought to be reflecting on very carefully in terms of redesigning our curriculum. And like Anna, I'm going to back off from naming my favourite country that we should sort of head to. But one of the things that we should usefully do, looking around the world at other countries, is look at what they do post-16 and figure out whether the slightly accidental and unusual system that we've got post-16 is right in terms of curriculum breadth. But I would just redesign the A-levels.
Could I ask David, are you confident that getting rid of AS levels has had the effect that you wanted? Because my understanding is that schools have to set internal exams at the end of the lower 6, on which they base their predicted grades for university. And so you've essentially sort of contracted it back to the schools, and the kids are still having to do the same thing.
I think Anna wants to add a point.
Yeah, can I just add a point, because it builds on Paul's. The gentleman up there said that
we will get to
the schools sort of funnel students, and it looks like that, but actually most of it's being driven by the higher education system. And likewise, the need to have internal exams and a grade in order to predict so that you can get to the admission system, which is a pre-grade admission system. So when you look at all these decisions and all the outcomes from them, a lot of them are being really driven by what's needed at the end of it to enter higher education. If we start from that, then it becomes a bit clearer that you can't reform one bit without thinking about that side of things, because otherwise schools will still have to encourage students to specialise, because that's what universities require, because we have a 3-year degree.
My answer to Paul's question is I don't know. The aim was to create more time to learn rather than to prepare for examinations. But I fear the truth is, not just in preparing for sort of university and university entrance, that we now have a phenomenally accountability-driven system because of the decisions we take as a government, largely because we want the bottom performing young people, there to be an intense focus on improving their attainment. So we have hyper-accountability, and therefore all schools, not just in disadvantaged areas, but right up to even some of the elite private schools, spend all of their time preparing people for examinations. All of the advice and feedback is about how to, maximize your results on that 5-point or whatever it is question. And I used to be quite good at just passing exams myself, so I was one of the people who sort of benefited from a system that allowed you just to focus on the examination. But even I'm frightened now by the extent to which in the last sort of 4 years of education prior to university, we have an accountability-driven system.
Should we give people then some credit for studying something at 16 without having to necessarily pass an exam? It's almost as though it's only actually existed, your knowledge you're studying,
well, we may.
If you've got a grade.
The problem is that unless you give things, once you have that hyper-accountability system, and we know why we've got it, and we've got it in order to try to bring the tail up, but once you've got it, unless you include things in the hyper-accountability, people just don't take them seriously. And it's very difficult to sort of add small things in and say, well, we'll add in something about PE or long lunch breaks, and that'll be added to the accountability system. Because then if you don't add all the other things that schools do in, those other things get squeezed out. So I don't know whether there's an easy answer to it.
I'm going to stop you there just because I want to allow some more time for questions. Gentleman in the blue shirt. I'm going to do the same and take 2. So after that, we'll come to the gentleman here as well.
Malik Batkup, Synapse. I think 2 things I'd remark on and question. One, I think, if one can say the elephant in the room is, in fact, what is education for? And we focused a little bit on the vocational side of education. And you were saying, in fact, that it may be vocational, but people don't go on to do the work that the degrees they've got should fit them for. So it's not vocational, even though it's notionally vocational. But the question I would ask is, do you think that as a result of the quasi-privatization of universities due to student fees, and they're now acting as businesses rather than the halls of academe of yesteryear, do you think that will constrain their ability to make some of the changes that you might regard as desirable? Because some of them may very well be bust in 10 years' time as a result of the fact that if there's a drop-off in student numbers or they don't become popular. They have much less policy flexibility running as businesses as they currently are than they might have done previously.
Okay, hold that thought, and we'll come to the gentleman sitting here just here, so we can pack in 2 questions at a time.
Thank you. My name's Hugh Morris. I'm from Wales. And I just wanted to make a comment about what's been said so far. It seems quite English-centric. There are AS levels in Northern Ireland and in Wales. There are higher in Scotland. And I just wonder whether part of the challenge is an overly centralised system, and maybe there could be scope for some experimentation through devolved nations, or indeed through devolution to regions within England. In Wales, the Education Minister Kirsty Williams from the Liberal Democrat Party has instituted a review of 16 to 19 qualifications, which will take place over the course of the next 12 months.
Okay, so let's take that university point. They're driven by what has been called even by ministers, a sort of bums on seats necessity to fill certain courses that are cheaper to deliver. how can you then get them to change to offering something different? I mean, there have, Paul, been incentives put in place more recently around 2-year degrees, for which the uptake has been remarkably low across the sector.
But on the whole, I mean, the answer is you can change incentives and change behaviour. And what has happened is that there is a, as you pointed out, a significant incentive to get more people through the door because more money is attached. The limits were taken off, and many, though not all, the universities responded pretty much as you would expect. I mean, let's remember, how does the funding system work? It's supposedly a loan, but you don't pay it back if you don't earn very much. So if you're sort of a marginal student, the cost of going to university in terms of the fees is likely to be pretty low. If you're the university itself, you get your 9,000 or your 9,250 a year, whoever you bring in through the door. And the numbers coming through the door have gone up pretty substantially as a result. You could change those. You could change those incentives in terms of the amounts that universities get for different subjects, as to some extent Philip Auger was suggesting. You could give them more for particular subjects than for others. I mean, that sticks in the craw a bit as a sort of economist who thinks that the market ought to work rather than have central planning. But maybe there's such a big issue around incentives and information here that you need something. Along those lines. So I think your question was phrased around the marketisation of the university sector and a possible going bust in the future. I think this is a sector which has always responded to the incentives that that have been put in front of it. I think will continue to do so. I think the risk around going bust is more that I think this is a sector where it's pretty hard to imagine genuinely a university going bust. At best, at worst, you'd expect a sort of managed takeover. So you've sort of got it's not quite the sort of banking too big to fail kind of situation, but I think there is a sense that you don't have quite the same kind of constraints that you might have in a properly marketized world, but you have got the incentives to bring the money in, and clearly a number of universities have taken pretty big risks in terms of the scale of borrowing that they've put in place on the assumption that student fees will continue to come into the future.
I'll come to your point about the curriculum in a moment, but of course we do have diversity across the UK in terms of HE. We've got a limit in Scotland, and they have had problems getting the pace of mobility, social mobility, that England has had in terms of higher education, and actually recently Audit Scotland pointing out the desperate financial pressures on some Scottish universities. Wales has gone down a very different route, with the government subsidy being diverted essentially into living costs rather than into subsidising picking up the tuition fees. What do you think would make a difference, Anna? I mean, do you think we've got this experimentation going on? There are jeopardies around trying to limit numbers on particular courses, aren't there, in terms of social mobility?
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a clear trade-off here. I mean, I don't think when you look back over the last 50 years of our education history that we've achieved significant inroads into the relative gap in your likelihood of going on to a profession if you come from a lower socioeconomic background without expansion. So, and it's fairly logical. If we expand the higher education system, we will open up opportunities for students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to come in. If we don't, then every student from a lower socioeconomic background who comes in is displacing someone else's place from a higher socioeconomic background, and you can work out the political economy of that and how likely that is to happen. So we need to be clear that expansion is a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for social mobility. But what are you expanding the system to, right? I mean, if you're opening up the system and expanding it but not giving students the skills they need in the labour market, it's a false promise. So that's the other aspect of it that we really need to think hard about. But I would agree with Paul that if you have a financial model that provides no cost to ever-increasing numbers of students, that really is a problem. So even if we think expansion is desirable, it needs to be managed. And at the moment, there isn't really much in the system that would check that. And coming back to your point, I mean, funnily enough, we'd just come from a meeting this morning where we were talking about the huge amounts that we can learn from comparisons across the different countries of the United Kingdom, whether it's curriculum breadth in Scotland or issues around the real barriers to higher education participation, which were much more about living costs, which we can perhaps pick up from Wales. But I think the other thing that we mustn't lose sight of is that you cannot change one system without it having implications for the other. So, these things don't, because of those, the borders, sorry. But then there's the other aspect of it, which is, we've got different policy regimes, but we often have labour markets that are essentially sort of fairly seamless across those countries, and that's another problem. We still have shortages, and your graduates just move to a different part of the United Kingdom. So we do need to solve this together.
So I just want to pick up on the point about the curricular reforms. The review that's underway in Wales now, 16 to 18, follows a very substantial overhaul of the school curriculum up to 16 in Wales, which in many ways is philosophically similar to what's happened in Scotland and quite different in some ways from the very knowledge-based, traditionally academic curriculum in England. So, for example, digital skills are embedded as a core part of the Welsh curriculum. So we have real-time experimentation across the UK. David, what do you make of the idea that we should give greater autonomy to the English regions to do this? I mean, a very topical subject. People want a greater say. And we know actually teacher autonomy is a feature of quite a lot of the very successful. That's something that does read across quite a lot of the very successful education systems.
We're starting that at such a low level of sort of system capacity, I would say, in terms of the ability to make different judgments across England, that I probably wouldn't go down that track. I'd learn from the experience of what's going on in the rest of the United Kingdom, see if we can figure out what's working and make sure that the individual parts of the United Kingdom learn the lessons. But I also think that this is one of the areas where the breadth of the debate and the number of participants is actually very, very narrow. A lot of it has been based on the instincts of a few of the people who are the lead policymakers in this area over the last few years. I think many countries, and the OECD, as you probably know, are doing this at the moment themselves, are looking in a much more measured way at what the curriculum should look like and how it should be developed over the decade ahead, what sort of skills, knowledge, values, and so forth we ought to be delivering into our education systems. We could really benefit from doing that in England, if I can be a bit parochial. I don't think we've done that properly as a country. And one of the areas where some non-political, non-policymaker input with a longer-term vision, rather than everything being done by ministers at very short notice, one area that would really benefit from that would be curriculum design. People sort of yearn for some of the decision-making around education to be taken away from politicians and the short-term decision-making. A lot of that, I think, is quite unrealistic because politicians are not going to give up their ability to tinkering around with the accountability system and funding and so forth. But curriculum and qualifications are surely necessarily, ideally, long-term issues that shouldn't be designed and redesigned over short periods of time. And I think we're desperately in need in England of some serious thinking about that and serious looking forward.
Is there also a fundamental cultural problem? You were talking about the hierarchy of bursaries earlier. That, for example, the knowledge and understanding of technical and vocational education within the department is low compared to the lived experience and knowledge and understanding of higher education.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I mean, the aspiration of many politicians and policymakers over the last 15 years, for entirely good reasons, has really been to open up to young people from disadvantaged backgrounds the more academic routes that those individuals think are actually the pathways to the top. So their own understanding of the vocational and technical pathways is not strong. They often see it, even if they won't say this, as a second-class sort of pathway. And of course, we have a lot of siloing of policy in the education department. The early years bit is separate from the schools bit. The schools bit from 16 to 18 for entirely historical reasons. The HE system. And while sometimes redesigning government for the sake of it can actually be a very unprofitable activity, one of my reflections, having left as a minister, was how unhelpful a lot of what we were doing in the department was as a consequence of different people being responsible for curriculum, capital, revenue, spending, and so forth throughout the education pathway. It meant that none of these things were properly joined up, that, you know, we had early years education really being a childcare activity because it wasn't linked with schooling. You know, as we've seen from Paul's recent research, the funding of education, the zigzags all over the place as you go through the education system, doesn't look very logical at all. I found out at the end of my time in the education department that while I was the minister in charge of capital for schools, I had somehow managed to monopolise the entire capital budget. So there was no budget at all for early years. You know, if you wanted a capital facility, if you were building a new school and you wanted an early years facility, there wasn't any budget at all because the school minister at some stage had scooped the whole lot up. If I'd been the minister responsible for capital from early years right through to the end of 16 to 18, I don't know whether it could reach to universities as well, you would have had a far more rational bit of thinking about where you wanted to spend your money, instead of ministers based upon the power and influence they had, protecting their bits of the budget and not other bits. And the same could be said, of course, for 16 to 18 education, where I confess we have a sort of silly and irrational system, largely for political reasons rather than from any careful judgment that's been made about the needs of the system.
Okay, I think we have time for a gentleman just here, and there's a gentleman behind him a few rows up. We might pack in a couple more. And then one last question probably from the gentleman here. But we'll take these two first. I'll come back to you, sir.
Ashwin Kumar from Manchester Met University. The conversation started with Paul very eloquently talking about the 20-25% of children that leave school without sufficient qualifications to make progress in the labour market. And Anna, you talked about how curriculum design was part of the problem, but that actually the real solutions were complex and were expensive. But we didn't really get the opportunity to find out what those complex and expensive solutions would be, because I think, given that it's a driver of some of the productivity conversation and social mobility and inequality, actually, if they're complex and expensive, but they'll do a lot of good, perhaps we should know about them a bit more and, you know, perhaps do them.
Okay, well, Anna's now got about 2 minutes to think about what the solutions would be while we hear the next question.
Ollie Clifton-Moore from the Department for Education. Firstly, a point, we have joined early years and schools together. So
yes, that's a good idea. I think that's a good idea.
Secondly, the children born today will be there in their early careers in 2050. So really, the question that we're pondering ourselves is, how do we prepare an education system for people who are not yet born in an economy that we don't know what it looks like? What would you advise today's ministers to do about it, and how do you get them to care about it?
Okay, so those are two fantastically impossible questions for you to answer. So, Anna, if you were going to make a package of interventions, where would you wave your magic wand?
So when I said they were complex and expensive, I didn't, but perhaps complex is the wrong word. We actually know a fair amount of the kinds of things we should be doing. We need to invest early. We probably need family-based literacy interventions early, not just once the child has reached school. Well, not probably, we definitely do. We need additional resource on the grounds that once a child, as we saw in the charts, falls away in terms of achievement by age 11, it's very difficult to get them back. So we really need to think about the fact that the socioeconomic gap in literacy and numeracy widens during the latter end of primary school and into secondary, and what we can do to fix that. And that's what I meant about expensive, because you have to prioritize essentially ensuring that those literacy and numeracy skills are pretty much up to snuff by the time they start secondary. And the schools cannot do it all, and they certainly can't do it all with the current level of resourcing. Your point aside is that some schools are doing much better than others, and we can learn, and there's shared practice. But when you dig at the schools that are doing it much better than others, be really mindful of why. They're in labour markets where they can attract teachers more readily. They may have communities, particularly minority ethnic communities or immigrant communities, that do far better in education. In other words, their parents have more of a commitment to that, and that's coming sort of travelling through with the child into the school. There are lots of reasons, so we need to, that's why it's complicated. But it's not impossible, we do know, we need to prioritise it.
Paul, your crystal ball for ministers trying to design an education system for the labour market in 20 to 30 years' time. Just to give you one extra element to that, of course, the Leo data we're seeing now, some of that is from people who are the first in family going to university. So I'm also curious as to whether or not some of these numbers will, by this 30-year timeout, some of these numbers will shift as their children go to university and perhaps make more informed or different choices because their parents have got a degree.
I'm sure the numbers will shift, and I'm sure there is a difference according to the generation when you go through. Looking out to 2050, I don't know. I mean, the Productivity Commission report that I quoted at the beginning of my presentation was looking out to 2030, and they were talking particularly about numeracy skills, communication, digital management skills of that kind being particularly necessary, I think, just based on the sense of what's trends that we've seen over recent years. But I think part of the answer is everything that we've heard at the moment. It's seeing the education journey through from 3 right the way through. I mean, in terms of what works in education policy, we can make a difference. I mean, if you focus on a particular group of kids at age 5 or 7 or 11, you will have an effect on them. But because partly of the way that these things work, they then tend to get ignored at the next point at 12, age 7 or 12 or whatever next is. You need to be focusing across their life through the school system. It's clearly important, these sort of softer communications and other skills, which are increasingly valuable in the labour market. One of the slides that didn't make the cut was one showing that the returns to analytical skills have grown over time, and the returns to sort of teamwork management, soft skills have grown over time. So we know that those things are going to be more important as we go forward. So yeah, it's very hard to say anything more specific than that. May I kind of I've just remembered an answer to the previous question, which is another chart of mine that didn't quite make the final cut, or 2 charts of mine that didn't make the final cut, which I really wanted to put up. One we haven't talked about at all, which is the difference between boys and girls in all of this, in that girls do hugely better than boys throughout the education system. And I think if we're looking forward, we do need to think about why that is, and do we care that 30% more girls go to university than boys, that girls are 35% more A-star to B at A-level from girls and boys. They do 20% better in terms of 5 good GCSEs than boys. So I think one of the things we need to think about for the future is that. And if we're thinking about the the marketisation of the higher education system, another slide that didn't quite make the cut, which I loved, was it was entitled, "Aren't these students getting clever?" And that's because the fraction of them getting firsts and 2-1s has grown just dramatically over the last 10-15 years. Now that's a real problem, because that means as an employer, you look at all these guys with 2-1s or firsts, you've got no idea, literally no idea how good they are. So what do? You look at their A-level results and and how good what the reputation of the university is. So you've got a market which is absolutely failing to distinguish for the labour market who's any good, and that's one of the reasons I think why those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who might go to the less high prestige universities, they come out with a 2-1, an employer has literally no idea what that's worth.
Paul, we're overrunning very slightly, but I promised the gentleman in the centre here that there was someone who wanted to ask a question, or we may wrap up if everyone feels that we're there. I think we're there, more or less. David, a last word, crystal ball advice to ministers of the future, 2050.
Yeah, my thought on that would be that there are 2 bad ways of making a curriculum. One is to say, this is what I did when I was at school. We'll just read it that way. I'm not saying that's anyone in particular. The other, which, I would agree with Michael Gove on this entirely, is to sort of sit down and say the 2050 economy is going to look like, so many butchers and so many IT people and this industry and that industry. The government can't forecast reliably what the economy is going to look like next year, let alone in sort of 50 or 30 years' time. But as Paul's hinted at, you can have an intelligent, sensible discussion about what core knowledge you'll need, what core skills you'll need, how the education system, what its role is in terms of value creation, citizenship. That's a meaningful, sensible discussion to have. Many other countries are having that type of discussion now and are doing so in a thoughtful, deliberative way, not just in a sort of knee-jerk, this is what worked well for me type way. And I think we could usefully have that type of more open discussion in this country.
That feels like a good point at which to stop the formal conversation in here. Thank you all very much indeed for coming to this 50th anniversary debate on education. And please do continue the conversation outside. There are drinks available in the room where there was tea and coffee beforehand. Thank you all very much indeed, and to our panellists, Paul Johnson, David Laws, and Professor Anna Vignoles. Thank you.